Welcome, northeastern tree fruit workers. Looking forward to this week, the third week in April 2021. Apple scab's primary infection period has begun for many of us who are watching those weather models for infection periods and making decisions about applying preventative and kickback fungicides to protect their trees from apple scab infection. However, some of us are still waiting for the infection period to start. Rule of thumb says not to be too concerned until models surpass 5 to 10% ascospore maturation. In other words, we're really waiting until those overwintered structures on the ground really start spitting out those spores. Stay tuned for a discussion on how a really good sanitation approach for overwintered inoculum could mean starting that primary infection season later than that rule of thumb. Not being a pathologist myself, I am loath to try and summarize this, but a key takeaway is that those overwintered fungal structures are on leaves, which drop to the ground in the fall and literally chill out until about this time of year. Chopping up those leaves and applying a source of nitrogen like urea does the work of decomposing the leaves where the fungal structures live, thereby decreasing the success of the fungi. Long story short, it's not too late to get out there and do some leaf chopping, but stick around to hear the experts describe it. That's about 15 minutes in. This is the time of year you might be assessing your orchard's tarnished plant bug pressure. Stay tuned for a little tarnished plant bug history, but in a nutshell, tarnished plant bug is kind of a non-issue unless you've got a really terrific habitat in and around your orchard, so know if you're in a hot spot or not. Speaking of alternative habitats, stay tuned for a discussion about how broadleaf weed management might impact pollinator protection. Eliminating some of those flowering weeds from the orchard understory is a good way to reduce exposure of crop protection materials to foraging bee species, and it's always been recommended as a best practice for reducing rosy apple aphid success. We have more questions than answers here, but another way to think about pollinator protection in the orchard for sure. Peach growers should be thinking about brown rot protection in blooming peaches. Find a link to some recommendations from Rutgers in the show notes below, but stay tuned for the discussion about 30 minutes in about brown rot and botrytis in peach, including some information about materials with kickback that can be applied after this weekend's rain. More discussion about 35 minutes in about balancing the risk and rewards of making these early season applications during extreme weather conditions. We do discuss sulfur and high temperatures, but another one to worry about is applying Captan within 4 to 10 days of an oil application. That's a pretty broad range, but the short end reflects sunny, warm days when the oil will dissipate quickly, and the long end reflects cool, rainy weather where the oil will stick around a little bit longer and cause some problems when you apply Captan. Do listen to the discussion that follows. It sounds like the leaf damage that follows this overlap might look pretty gnarly, but might be a non-issue in the long run. Finally, we wrap up with some weird and random stuff. Pear thrips sound like an unusual one, but something we see causing some damage to apple buds, especially during a long pre-bloom season like the one we're seeing this year. You might see some polka-dotted flowers later on. Asian jumping worms is showing up here and there in the Northeast. This is an invasive worm that's been brought into sites with compost and other organic materials. One of the key ways to identify them is by their behavior. So something to be aware of because they can be pretty devastating to the soil ecology when introduced. So find a link to those videos.
While Dan does that, I can ask a dumb question to the group. And it's great that there's so many pathologists on. When you look at NUA and you're looking at the ascospore discharge totals, what percentage are we looking at to really trigger, now's the time to go out and cover up, and when's the time to go out and use a kickback material? Is that generally that 3%? Is that where we're kind of ballparking that?
How dirty is your orchard?
It depends. I love it.
I mean, the magic number, and Vincent and Dave can correct me, but nobody used to get very concerned when the models were showing 5% and depending even 10% mature ascospores. Yeah, Vincent, go ahead.
In a very clean orchard. I mean, McCarty had trials where he wouldn't start spraying until pink, you know. I don't advise that. I'm a little more cautious than that, but it really depends how clean your orchard is.
But I think, go back to Dan's comments, I think that 5 to 10% was when we were doing squash mounts and that sort of thing. With the newer model, I've never been sure what should be a trigger point for starting to spray or for considering it to be a big discharge, because as I expressed last week, it's totally based on a Mills table as far as I know, and so it's not, unlike RimPro, it's not going to take into account the temperatures during the wetting period and all that sort of thing in terms of the, well, it will to some degree, because the more degree days you accumulate, the more ascospores are released. But I'm not sure that it's a very accurate depiction. I much prefer the RimPro analysis of how many spores have been released during a wetting period, because it takes it sort of an hour at a time, contingent by contingent. And Vincent, you can correct me if I'm wrong.
No, you're totally right. And we like the RimPro because sometimes at bug break, we already have many ascospores that are ready to discharge, like this year, right? You know, our event that we are facing right now, there's, you know, we have from the towers a lot of spores, and the RimPro really shows you that this rain event needs one treatment, even though we're sort of early.
Hey, I have a question. You might not know the answer. Because of this rain event, how do the models handle it when it's snow? Because we're getting snow right now.
The models don't. This is where you have to use common sense. And the analogy I use is of the Japanese tourist who drove into the bay following his GPS. That, you know, if it's snowing, it's obviously going to seal in ascospores, and so, but you will still, as far as the models are concerned, at least as the one I think RimPro and New One are both this way. They just view that as leaf wetness.
Wait, what do you mean seal in? Like they're obviously not gonna.
If the snow's sticking on the ground, then it's a physical barrier. They just can't go through it.
Right. And I didn't realize it was so cold for you down there, but models, I mean, at least RimPro accounts for temperature for discharge. So discharge is much reduced. Discharge rate is much reduced when it's cold. So it's not only the infection that takes longer time, but the ejection is go down with temperature for sure.
So you'd say, however, that people who are, oh, I'm sorry.
Well, be aware that the majority of ascospores are discharged within the first few hours of a wetting period. So if it was raining yesterday and snowed during the night, it really doesn't make that much difference other than the cold temperature delaying the infection process.
Exactly, and that's what happened. Is that most of it we got daylight wetting before this snow came along, and so in fact there is a good, you know, there's a reasonable chance of infection. So the ideal situation in terms of management is that you were covered going into the wetting, but failing that, you know, if you weren't, then what to do? And there it gets a little dicier. You probably need to get into using a systemic of one sort or another. I think we're still in a situation where Vanguard would work pretty well, and Sillet probably. But you could use other things. You could use this new Sevia that's come out. You could use Inspire Super. You could use, I don't know, the DMIs in general. What do you guys think, Dave?
Well, last week we discussed it a bit, and my concern is that I think Carrick and his grad students showed that with difenoconazole, which was the strongest of the DMIs, where you had some resistance to the first generation DMIs, difenoconazole still worked, but it worked better on semi-resistant varieties like Empire as compared to super susceptible varieties like Jersey Mac. And my concern is that Sevia, I don't know enough about the compound, but my guess is it's just a step beyond difenoconazole. And so how quickly we select for resistance to that one, I think is an open question. I haven't seen that addressed. But if you have an orchard with high levels of DMI resistance, I think, you know, you can use it, but I don't know how often you can use it.
George Sundin has some really interesting data on that, Dave, that I saw this last week, where he was using it in his test block where they've got DMI resistance up the yazoo, and the Sevia really performed very well, and even somewhat better than difenoconazole Inspire.
For how long?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I accuse George of being in the business of disseminating resistant scab strains, but
So I'm sorry, I might have missed it, but I missed the beginning of this discussion, and people might have already talked about it. But you know, we've got really low spore maturity in a lot of places, less than 10%, sometimes less than 5%. And are people worried about an event like this, which is kind of dubious to begin with, in a situation where the spore maturity is, you know, I mean, do we have a threshold anymore for that in a clean orchard? You know, what point do we start? Or is it just like if we're showing anything, we go nuts?
Well, I think we addressed that briefly in that we didn't used to worry about low spore maturities when we were doing the squash mounts, because spores would look mature before they were ready to discharge. But the newer models are based on actual temperature relationships, and probably when they say 5% mature, according to Dave Gaduri, who developed a lot of that, he means that 5% will discharge. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if that's always true, but that's the general premise. And so I don't think you can disregard those low counts in NUA the way we did when I was basing at least my recommendations on squash mounts. I think the duration of the wetting and the temperature at the time of the wetting and the amount of tissue, and of course the amount of inoculum in the orchard are the critical things. So I'm going to throw in a curveball here, and you know, I know people in New York would really shoot me down, but I still much prefer the old Mills table as revised by Al Jones that shows light, medium, and heavy infection periods. Those were developed based on Bill Mills going out and actually looking at how long leaves were wet and then how much scab developed. So they really integrated to some degree the temperature effects on the ability of spores to find the host and create infection at different temperatures. So I just looked at NUA. According to NUA, we've had or will have in an hour or two about 24 hours at 42 degrees in the Hudson Valley. By the current NUA standards, that's an infection period. It's a black-white kind of thing. But if I look at the old Mills table, it's just barely a light infection period because the temperatures have been so cool. And that tells me that although I wouldn't want to ignore it, I don't think it's a huge risk if growers had sprayed in the last 5 days before the rain. Plus, we've only had about an inch of rain. However, to go back to Anna's question, what about the discussion that went on online? I don't know how many of you read that, but Vincent claims his data show very little redistribution, and redistribution is a big deal because as leaves expand, there's new tissue out there that wasn't sprayed the last time you sprayed. I think it's more of a big deal once we start getting terminal shoots, because then you actually have new leaves appearing much more quickly than you do prior to bloom, when you primarily have cluster leaves opening and expanding. So I'm not quite as concerned about the redistribution effects this time of year as I would be once we get to mid-bloom and we start getting rapid terminal shoot or terminal leaf expansion. But understanding how, we know that Captan and Mancozeb redistribute, sulfur redistributes to some degree, although it tends to wash off fairly quickly. But all these other products that are formulated to enter the leaves, I think how they redistribute is still somewhat of an open question. And I'm still not sure I believe Vincent's data, because we haven't discussed how he did it.
I'm gonna poke in just as a time check, just to say, I was gonna try to do a dismount on this question, but it might be more of a summary to catch up people who signed on a little bit late. The original question is, what should we do this week? And it sounds like my question about snow might be a moot point, because the areas that we work in that are receiving snow are probably not far along enough in the cycle to really be worried about it, from what Kathleen had to say. But I'll kind of pass it off to Vincent. I think you had a response.
Well, I just want to make clear that the data we have on redistribution is redistribution to a new leaf and not within leaf redistribution. So any claim that Captan sulfur, whatever, will cover up some surfaces of the leaf that was sprayed, but expanded and all that, I have no opinion on that. Our data is you spray a tree and the leaf that a new leaf that appears after that spray will not get redistribution, or I mean, it's very little. It's noise in our data. We see it. I mean, I can prove that there is some redistribution, but would I rely on that? Never. Not with the data I saw ever again.
I have a question for Vincent or Dave. Anyone can answer, or a couple of weeks before I got a question. I'm an entomologist. I got a question from a grower on Long Island. Like, he had serious scab last year. Going back to Vincent's point, how dirty it is. It was dirty. And he asked me whether nitrogen or urea spraying will help to reduce the scab spore distribution in it. And if it helps, then what percentage? Like, is that, I can say 70% control? And then the next question was like, is that helpful if he spray urea the previous season at the basically at the end of the season, after harvesting all the fruits, when the leaves are a little bit snails on that tree? Is that also helpful, or the spring application, if there is anything work for that? Yeah.
Either one works well. I forget the percentages, but I think up to about 70 to 85% of the ascospores can be eliminated by applying urea. The fall application is difficult because the leaves need to be on the ground or fall within 10 days. Otherwise, the urea is taken up into the twigs, and it doesn't necessarily have as much value, I think, although there may be more recent data. The spring application is good if you can do it early. I mean, you could do it even now, but it's a little late if the tree's already a tight cluster. You've lost most of the advantage. What the urea does is hasten the breakdown by fungi and earthworms, and eliminates the overwintering leaf litter so that there's not so many ascospores. And it may have some direct effect on the fungal ability to form ascospores. That's less clear to me. So either one is good, but I think if he hasn't done it, he's missed the boat for this year, and he better just keep a real tight fungicide schedule.
And that the leaf need to be like breakdown by mowing or something, or it's just direct?
So let me just jump in real quick, please. So when you combine urea with leaf chopping, which is the mowing that you were just going to get to, actually I believe it was Dan, your work showed that you get a 90% reduction in inoculum. The majority of that is actually being accomplished by the leaf chopping. was my understanding of that. While the urea contributes to it and definitely does break down the leaf tissue, what you're doing is with more effective with that leaf chopping, because you're breaking it up into smaller pieces, making it more readily digestible by the organisms in the soil. And you're also flipping those leaves over. So the osteols of the fruiting bodies are actually negatively geotropic, right? So they point upwards so they can shoot up. When you flip it, they're going to shoot down and they do no good. So that leaf chopping is actually more effective as a means of sanitation if you're going to do one or the other. And at this point, the urea ship has kind of sailed. So if they can get in and do that leaf chopping, it would be good.
So how much time do you need, though, between chopping or putting down urea and the beginning of primary scab season?
The chopping is immediate. I mean, that flipping over occurs right then.
Okay, so how about the urea? How much time is needed?
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't think we've got a good.
We don't. No, I'm not aware of a time frame, but you got to figure, because it's a encouraging chemical breakdown, it's going to take a little bit longer. So, the sooner the better.
I think another point to be made about leaf chopping, Vincent came up with this great machine called the Elimine that would reach under the trees and really beat the hell out of the leaves. So if you're leaf chopping, do your best to try to get whatever is in the row out where it's actually going to get chopped.
The name of the equipment was better than the equipment. It turns out that having a broom to brush the leaves and all that, these brooms don't last very well. We had to look at different materials and all that. So people are still tinkering about it. So the idea is great. I mean, if you can chop leaves and etc., but it's hard. Orchard floor isn't flat, and it's so whatever you can do is going to be useful. But we're better at marketing than engineering.
So Faruque, does that answer your question sufficiently?
Yeah, everything was very good. Now I can explain a little bit better to that grower. I said that it worked because I was reading some literature on that, but I was not sure that how effective. Now I got some good idea, so I can tell. Just the last question, like what is the best time? Is that in March? You said, someone said that it's late right now, but the good time is like in March or something earlier than March?
Our answers to grower is that, hey, every year they manage to flail the branches that they just pruned. They manage to do that before spraying because, the sprayer needs to go in. So that's when you do it. You flail your branches at the same time you get rid of the leaves in the leaf litter. Just make the equipment you use better at getting at the leaves. You won't make it perfect, but that's the window.
Thank you.
One concern I have about flail mowing is that after winter snows and rains, those leaves are really oppressed to the ground. And to get those leaves, the flail mower has to be set very low, almost to the point that destroys the sod cover. And on hillside orchards like we have in the Hudson Valley, that means if you have to spray at green tip to half-inch green and there's been rain, you're working on a sheet of mud instead of sod. So I frankly prefer the urea without the leaf chopping on hillside orchards because, chopping the brush will help, but you won't get all of them. Even better is to keep your inoculum low and you don't have to worry about that by a good spray program during the season.
I think George maybe had something to say, and then maybe we can wrap up that conversation. Georgia, do you want to chime in?
Well, I remember the research that Bill McCarty was doing, bringing out leaf blowers, blowing some commercial leaf blowers down underneath the trees trying to blow the leaves out in the fall. And a lot of my growers that are not on the hillsides, but more in the flat. I like to use the flail more in the fall so that they're grinding up any drops to reduce those drops that bring in wildlife, and is trying to reduce the inoculum in the fall, or at least cut up the leaves smaller so they'll decompose faster over the winter months. And then we don't have that problem in a wet spring.
Good point.
Awesome. Well, hey,
if the leaves make it to the ground in the fall, though.
What was that again?
Well, the leaves, they stick to the trees in the fall. And, you know, for us, it's snowing before the leaves make it to the ground. So that's why the fall window for us is closed now. Unless you spray copper chelate of some sort with your urea to hasten leaf fall in the autumn, then maybe there's a chance there. But
you beat me to it, Vincent. I was going to come back with a lot of the growers are doing that to try to hasten the leaf fall and getting that decomposition taking place before the leaves get packed down into the ground.
Yeah, I like that solution. I read somewhere too that if you, it's a narrow window. Dave said 10 days, you know, or else the urea gets sucked up by the tree. But the coverage is much better if you can spray when the leaves are on the tree, and if you can then get the leaves down and whack them, then that's ideal. So there's the ideal. How realistic?
If the sprayer is calibrated properly, Dan.
Awesome. Well, Mike, did you get all your questions answered as far as apple scab? Should we move on to something else? Are you satisfied?
It depends. But yes, thank you, everyone.
Does anybody else? Jaime, what are you telling people about tarnished plant bug this year?
Well, thank you. Good morning, everyone. In early April, we deployed the traps. That's more than 10 orchards in Massachusetts. We have, for different experiments, more than 150 sticky cards deployed. And we just don't see them in high numbers. I think Kathleen reported the same thing. So we have just a few. The first captures were on April 6th. And then I don't know what to expect with the population this year. It's just that historically, tarnished plant bug in Massachusetts has not given trouble to growers. So injury has been low except for 2 years, is for about 15 years. I was checking the historical records. So there has been less than 1% every year, except a couple of years in 1998, something like that. So I am not recommending anything to growers before bloom. So for tarnished plant bug. And I'm very interested in the parasitic wasp that was released 25 years ago, but I just don't have the ability to do work in that area.
Ooh, I got some really interesting background from Alan about this, because somebody asked me and I said, I don't know. And I got a hold of Alan, who's standing on the side of the road waiting for his car to get fixed. And he's like, yeah, I'll tell you all about it.
Work. Yeah. No, please share, because the only thing, go ahead.
Oh, the history of it's really interesting, and like to the point where like he said a couple things that I didn't really understand, which he mentioned that alfalfa was a relatively new crop. As far as like the history of time. So I didn't realize that, but like what he was saying is like it is relatively new. And what they were saying is that the fact that there was a new crop made the natural enemies that typically parasitize that group were just not doing a great job hunting in that new crop. And that was where there was a problem. But I know that these species exist. Heather, you might know more about this than I do.
Yeah, I made a collection of tarnished plant bugs and sent them off to, who was it? Bill, somebody in Delaware before he retired. And we had,
the last name is Day? Is that last name Day?
That's what I think, Day. Bill Day. And I know, so I was collecting like in alfalfa in the end of summer, and we had some low level parasitism. It was present, you know, whatever the parasitoids were. I'd have to go look back at the papers.
Yeah,
so they were present, but the the level of parasitism was very low.
Yeah, so there was an effort to reconstitute the natural enemies that would be affecting tarnished plant bug, but it was getting it back up to like a pre-alfalfa situation. So it was definitely only reducing tarnished plant bug populations by a small percentage, whatever that I think it might have been a classical biocontrol project, but there was already existing natural enemies here and not a fix. Does that answer your question?
They has a publication in 1990, and he reports 36% in the first generation of tarnished plant bug parasitism, and 29% in the second. So in those particular years, 1987, 1988, it was a maybe higher parasitism rate than in other years. So all of this is because with tarnished plant bug, if injury is 1%, maybe 2%, but still you're able to sell that fruit because it's just a tiny mark on the fruit. I have been asking around, and that's not a concern for growers here in Massachusetts. So that's why, again, recommendation from me is just don't spray before bloom.
Does everybody agree with that? Or maybe we had a bigger problem in peaches last year?
That's exactly what I was going to ask Kathleen. The worst damage I saw was tarnished plant bug, was in a situation where it was a diversified farm where they had alfalfa grass within 100 feet thereabouts of a orchard. They went in, mowed the alfalfa grass field, and around 3 weeks later, we saw an explosion within the apple because I felt that we had that population that was in the alfalfa moved over into the orchard and started another population there, and we were on a soft program after Kirk, so population wasn't being controlled. In the fall, we saw a major increase in tarnished plant bug, so we were seeing injury, more of a pansy spot occurring on the fruit. So, the next year we put the traps up and we didn't see anything. Okay. And Alan checked the parasitism on it with his traps or his cages, and he said that, if I remember right, it was an area of 20 to 30%.
When was this, George? Was this like turn of the century? Was it
back in the late 90s after Alan went down and collected the insect down in Delaware and brought it up, and we released it at several different places. So snow's coming down like crazy here. So that, that's the only time I've seen it. And really, tarnished plant bug has been such a minor problem in putting the traps out. We've kind of almost stopped doing that because we haven't been catching it.
Yeah. And
numbers have been so low. So what Jaime's saying is basically what I have seen the last 10 years. Now, yes, you can have hot spots where they're occurring. And so having a trap out would be wise to just monitor to see if there is a hot spot, but usually it doesn't happen until somebody has a problem. Then we get the traps out the next year to prove it right now if we need that spray or not.
Kathleen, would you agree with that?
I agree with
absolutely. Yeah. No, I one thing, just a little data point. I've got some 300 odd traps out there. I found one plant bug so far this year. And something Dave mentioned last week that actually touches on this is the ground cover management, because I think growers are doing much more aggressive ground cover management than they did 30 years ago, whatever. And that makes a huge difference in tarnished plant bug. I think the worst orchard I had with plant bug was kind of a smorgasbord of small fruit and tree fruit crops. He had everything: strawberries, blueberries, raspberries, the whole thing. So they could just go from one to the other. And I noticed that his plant bug population seemed to be declining. And I asked him about it, and he said we mow all the time, and that seemed to fix it for them.
We see the similar what Kathleen just said. Yeah, I have seen some growers mow their field regularly. They get less problems. Some growers don't mow their orchard until the fruit is ready to harvest. And then suddenly they start mowing, and then they got high tarnished plant bug damage.
Yeah, we used to always tell people about that in peaches. Don't mow the peaches unless you've got an insecticide, in the tree before you do that, because they're gonna hop up out of the ground cover and into the tree.
Yeah, especially the low-hanging fruits. They got most damage.
Can I attempt to dismount from this one? A non-issue, unless you're in a hot spot, pay attention to mowing, especially if it's your neighbor and they're growing alfalfa.
I'd like to just throw out a question to the entomologist. Last week, I mentioned I feel strongly growers should be applying 2,4-D in the fall to eliminate broadleaves in the orchard for a variety of reasons, including protecting pollinators by not having the dandelion bloom. But I'm curious as to whether any entomologists have done studies to show that orchards with fewer broadleaves have less plant bug and or less rosy aphid. I think they should, but I don't know if that's been documented.
Well, I will throw it out to everybody is how often do you see rosy apple aphid in your region? Is this a rare occurrence or is this all over the place?
I saw one orchard last year, but it was just one single orchard. I mean,
yeah, like that.
15.
I've actually, and Heather has got, but I've been seeing it kind of like popping up here and there in very like isolated pockets.
Yeah, the same here.
It's very sporadic and it's variety specific also.
Okay. Heather?
Yeah, I've got a grower that a few years ago had problems on his Mutsu, and then a cider grower who there's quite a bit of rosy apple aphid, and he's had it year to year on some cider varieties. So yeah, variety specific, but can be pretty significant.
So it sounds like it's variety specific. Oh, Kathleen?
Yeah, I have one guy who said he never had a rosy aphid problem until UMass came out and planted narrowleaf plantain for predatory mites in the orchard, and ever since then he's had rosy
That's
aphid.
what I thought I might hear, honestly, especially since we're doing so much to diversify an already diverse landscape by adding pollinator plantings in. I mean, but all of you are saying, oh, it's variety specific, it's sporadic. Does anybody have any feeling that it had anything to do with like broadleaf weed management? Like, could you feel confident even commenting on that anecdotally? Because I haven't heard anything research-wise.
I've always been heard that it was very much associated with the narrowleaf plantain, that was, it's sort of secondary host.
But also docks, I bet that there's several weeds that it thrives on or goes to as a secondary host.
Gosh,
I think we don't know.
Really, really good question. I mean, like your point before, Dave, was a good one, is that like it couldn't hurt. It certainly won't make things worse to get rid of those alternate hosts for a sporadic pest. And if you're eliminating any possibility of exposing pollinators unnecessarily, that late season weed management makes a lot of sense to me.
How far does plant bug travel from perimeters?
I have seen that when it comes to damage, I have seen mostly in the perimeter. I don't see them going inside the block too much, and that's what I have recorded.
I have a quick question. I hope it's a quick question about brown rot that has come up, and that is, at this point, as we're getting snowed on and peaches are coming into bloom, at least down this way, is there any significant brown rot risk at this time such that a fungicide should go out? And my answer to that is yes. You should be worried enough about it to have some sort of fungicide going out on open blossoms. But I'd love to hear other people's opinion.
We ran a trial many years ago, soon after I started working in the Hudson Valley on plums, and we're putting on fungicides primarily for black knot, but decided to bring in plum blossoms to evaluate them for brown rot as well. And the surprise to me was that we had more botrytis blossom blight when we incubated those in the lab. I don't know how much of an an issue botrytis is, but I think, again, in cooler, damp weather where brown rot isn't as much of an issue, botrytis may be taking out more flowers than we are aware of. And therefore, I would agree with you, Dan, that a fungicide for brown rot, at least sometime, ahead of a wet period when flowers are open. I'm not too concerned when they're just at pink, but I don't think you want to totally skip your fungicide. And then if you looked at the Rutgers newsletter from 2 weeks ago, Norman Lancet had an article in there, and he's found that there's a lot more quiescent infection of peaches than we used to recognize. And he's talking about infections that occur between petal fall and pit hardening, but I think they could also occur as early as bloom. He's been putting on bloom sprays, so he wasn't concerned about that. He was looking more at what happens between petal fall and pit hardening. And on the plum trial I ran, we also found quiescent brown rot in plums we hadn't sprayed at all in the control plots. So I think it would be foolish to assume that in a fairly dry or cool year, if it's absolutely dry, there's probably no risk, but in a cool, damp year, I think you have other things that may cause a problem, either quiescent brown rot just because it incubates so slowly, or botrytis.
Hey, Dave, are there any materials that are going to work post-rainfall on those diseases in, say, peaches? Because we are in full bloom right now. And of course, it's quite wet. It'll dry off on Saturday.
Well, the premier botrytis materials are probably Vanguard, and I don't know if Scale is registered in stone fruit or not, frankly, but that group of materials have always been strong in botrytis until you get resistance. And there may be some resistance kicking around, but putting in a product that contained either Vanguard or Scala would give you some post-infection activity. The problem with botrytis is it develops a resistance to fungicides almost quicker than any other common tree fruit pathogen. So what works in a given orchard is often an open question. Topsin M might work fine. I mean, it used to be that resistance to the benzimidazoles was widespread, but because they haven't been used very much early, it may be that botrytis is again susceptible to Topsin M. I just don't know.
Speaking of Topsin M, Heather had a question of me the other day. Do you remember it, Heather?
I sure do, Dan. I was wondering about using Topsin M early in the season, like when you would start a powdery mildew spray, using Topsin M for powdery mildew control. I was wondering what people thought about that.
I think in orchards, if growers have been using Topsin M in late summer to control sooty blotch and fly speck, and maybe they aren't so much anymore, but I'd be really suspicious that the mildew is resistant and maybe even the botrytis in apples, but in stone fruits, I don't think it's been used very much anymore. So going back to it might be more of an option. I mean, the resistance to benzimidazoles is just so widespread. I don't know. I'm just doubtful that it would work even early in the season.
Then Dan asked me, why would somebody do this? And I just have some really low-key growers that want to buy as few pesticides as possible. You know, they're just to pick your own orchard. They're just open on weekends. And so I try and give them the, fewest pesticides to buy option. Anyway.
Yeah, but they ought to keep a bag of sulfur around for mildew because that's really inexpensive and really effective early season, as long as you don't have oil in there because it's not compatible with oil.
For the sake of the audio, I'm going to say that Vincent gave a thumbs up to having a bag of sulfur around.
Again, sulfur can cause some fruit burn if you get into high temperatures within a few days after it's applied. So in the Hudson Valley, growers who are marketing to, wholesale chain store buyers are a little leery of it, but for pick your own, I don't see that you'd have to worry about it too much.
Dave, what are high temperatures as it relates to sulfur?
Anything above 85.
Thank you.
I mean, I wouldn't apply it above 80, but if you apply it in the morning and it goes to 83, I wouldn't be too concerned. But once you get above 85, it'll cause some burning on the leaves and the fruit. And it's not going to be a burn you notice immediately, but if you hold up an apple and look at it at an angle, you'll see the surface of the fruit doesn't quite have the normal shine.
I would say even in the days prior to that temperature, that sulfur,
Yeah, so there's a couple of materials, oil as well, that we talk about using for various things, right? And the warning is temperature related, both cold and hot temperatures. So one of them, I think it's oil, 24 to 48 hours on either side of the application. That's kind of a big spread. So what's the practical duration of window? You know what I'm saying? After you spray sulfur, is it 24? Is it 36? Is it 48 hours? What's the, is it temperature based? What's the deal with all that? That's driving me nuts.
Well, I think there's no answers to those questions, because with sulfur, it's going to depend on the cultivar. It's going to depend on how succulent the foliage is. Perhaps what other products were applied prior. For example, if growers are applying urea at petal fall to get a boost to the fruit growth, that softens the leaves and will make them more susceptible to damage from other products like Captan and sulfur. If you have a little bit of rain on the sulfur, then wouldn't be too worried about high temperatures after that. So if you're applying it just ahead of a rain, you get a little rain, and then it goes up to 90, I don't think you'll get that much injury. You might get a little bit, but there's all kinds of factors involved there that are really difficult to sort out. And the same with the oil. Jaime, you may be able to comment on this. I've never been, or other entomologists, I've never been clear on how oil dissipates. Does it volatilize off, or does it rain off the foliage when it's applied? Because that relates to when you could apply Captan again following an oil spray.
If I understand correctly, it's actually they volatilize.
Yeah, that was my impression. And therefore, if we have warm, sunny days, the amount of time you need to allow between an oil spray and Captan is presumably less than if you have cool, cloudy days. But I've never seen anybody put that in writing, and I don't know how you would actually quantify it. But I think in terms of oil and Captan, the general recommendation is 7 to 10 days in between, either before or after. So at the Hudson Valley Lab, Peter and I had to screw up one year, and I sprayed oil in the morning. He sprayed Captan in the afternoon over some plots that he was trying to control diseases in. And, the leaves looked unhappy for about a week, but they were red delicious. The fruit sized normally, and the leaves recovered fairly quickly. So it's not always a total disaster, but you just don't want to recommend it. And red delicious are pretty resistant leaves anyway, but I sometimes think we blow these out of proportion.
I think it depends on the temperature. If it is very high temperature, then oil Captan and then high temperature is not a good combination.
Faruque, do you think we have enough information about this? Where should I look if I'm trying to find something to read up on about it?
I can search for that, but so far I understand when I talk with my other colleagues about oil application, so we always say that it's evaporate quickly into air.
Well, I think it would contribute greatly to our pathologist-entomologist relationships.
So I'll try to find some. In fact, somewhere I have a book about oil application on plants. It's an old book.
Awesome.
I'll see if I can get that information from that book. It's some sort of textbook about applying oil for insect and disease control purpose.
Cool.
Well, the problem is that with early season oil for mite and everything like that, then no Captan early season. And then Dave came out a few years ago and said, and with all those other things that are going into formulations in insecticides and fungicides now, then I'm worried about fruit finish. If you go in, say, pink to bloom, then there's no Captan time anymore. That would be a terrible, sad thing.
Well, actually, my suggestion was the petal fall first cover sprays when they're putting in foliar nutrients and thinners often at the same time, as well as some PGRs. So I'm not as concerned about putting Captan in until we get to that petal fall mix when growers are having 8-9 products in the tank, and it just becomes a nightmare.
That gets into, to some extent, into Vincent's they don't own enough sprayers problem, right?
One more question.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I brought up the parathrips because I do have a question about, Ron used to say that it was more, they apparently they feed into the ovaries and whatnot. And usually they're not a problem, but if we have a long pre-bloom period, maybe they can be a problem, and we're having a long pre-bloom period. So I don't know anybody, I know nobody outside New England has much experience with them. I don't know if anybody has anything.
Wait. What are you talking about, Kathleen?
Wait, you're seeing pear thrips and apple? What? Explain.
Yes. Yeah, this is, like I said, it's a New England thing. You got to learn about these things, Anna.
I never heard that. That's cool.
So, yeah, I don't know when, it was maybe 20 or 30 years ago, they started popping up, and they're sorry?
It's not parasilla. You're saying parathrips. I'm sorry.
Parathrips.
Okay. Yeah.
So these little skinny black guys that you'll see running around in the apple buds. And,
I saw a lot last week.
Yeah, they just started popping out, and I think we kind of figured, like 5 per bud cluster, which I have not seen a number like that. And maybe they're just causing thinning, which would be a good thing. But,
I saw a couple of buds last week that had like 7 in them. So, but you had a lot last year, and I didn't see any damage at all. So it seemed like also when we had these, this was back years and years and years ago, like you'd see polka dots on the petals. Do you remember that, Kathleen? Like,
oh yeah. So yeah, no, I don't know. But I just wanted to, throw that thought out there. Is it something? I am disinclined to worry about it, but I'm a little anxious about the fact that we may have, a number of weeks until we get to bloom, and they apparently don't mind cold temperatures because they've been active the last couple of days.
I would love to see some pictures if you can get some to see what you're talking about.
Yeah, I don't have any now, but I can get some.
Yeah, cool.
Just
awesome.
One other wild comment that you can think about till another week. Wouldn't apply to most growers, but if people are bringing in mulch, I'm not sure how many of you are aware of the Asian jumping worm, which is an imported pest. And I have a few blueberries and got mulch from our local landfill for free, and I think brought in Asian jumping worm with it. So if you have organic growers who are mulching, I don't know the long-term effects of that, but it's not necessarily something we want to be spreading around. You can look it up online. There's lots of stuff about it online.
Yeah, I think we have a fact sheet on like how to identify you identify the worm by the behavior. It's like quite active, right?
It acts like a snake. And the ones in my garden were about 8 inches long and traveled with their heads up just like a snake. And if you try to grab them, they'll just wriggle right out of your fingers, which is why they're called the jumping worm.
We have them pretty much throughout Rhode Island, I think. So I know I've got them in my yard, and I haven't had any mulch delivered. They're everywhere.
I've never seen these things. I never even heard of them. That's wild.
I'll bring some to our in-person Twilight meeting.
A quick comment about them is they're devastating to soil ecology. I saw there was a comment on chat because they reproduce what's the word, without male or female, all of them that can reproduce, they can go up to 300 per square meter by the end of the season. And they take all the organic matter out of the soil and basically leave the soil devoid of any organic matter. So in terms of soil health, they're a disaster.
Yeah, let's see some pictures and some videos. We'll put some cool stuff up when we find it.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is if growers don't have them, they may want to be made aware of the fact that moving organic materials from off-site could introduce that pest. If, as Heather said, they're already endemic, then it's probably no big deal.
Yeah, but I mean, like, it's not in people's zeitgeist. They think weed seed, they think plant pathogens. I think most people assume worms are good. And
right. Yeah, but they're not endemic here, at least in Massachusetts. I know we are aware of them, like sort of peripherally, but they have not become established here.
I just assume they don't.
Yeah, I don't think we've had them for very many years, but I noticed them in my yard. I think 2 years ago. I was like, they're more like snakes, which I'm not very fond of.
Are they officially an invasive as opposed to, okay.
They are, but they I think were first found in the US in 1955 or something like that, a long time ago. But they seem to have suddenly spread much more rapidly, whether that's due to climate change or nobody seems to know why.
Maybe municipal composting.
Maybe.
Either that or we're not using enough inorganic fertilizer.
All right. Any other weird,
great to see you guys.
Any more weird stuff before we sign off?
Oh, thank you.
Have a good week.
Thank you, Anna.
Thanks, Anna.
Thanks.